Hello friends, I am Mr. Dark, and the story you are going to hear tonight is very scary. You are going to shiver after listening to it. So are you ready for this very scary journey? Let me tell you beforehand that the story is based on real incidents. So let's start. A blizzard whipped across the narrow streets of Hollows Peak, a remote town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, blanketing the town in heavy snow. It was the first week of January, and though the bitter cold drove most locals inside early, Hollows Peak bustled with tourists celebrating the new year. Cozy inns, rustic cabins, and small restaurants along the main street buzzed with holiday cheer and laughter, despite the snowstorm. Ryan Callahan, a local from Hollows Peak, huddled near the entrance of Benny's Grill, rubbing his hands together to keep warm as he waited for his friends. The night was particularly special. Ryan hadn't seen his college friends since they'd graduated. Tonight, they were reuniting to celebrate New Year's together, and it was supposed to be a night of fun, nostalgia, and laughter. "Come on, where are you guys?" Ryan muttered under his breath, glancing at his watch. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, shivering as he answered the call. "Ryan!" It was Mary, sounding impatient. "Where are you? Ethan and I are freezing out here." Ryan looked up and saw them across the street, Mary waving enthusiastically, bundled in a thick coat, while Ethan stood beside her with a wide grin. Andy, the fourth in their group, arrived moments later, pulling up in his truck with a wave. Reunited at last, the friends greeted each other with hugs and high fives, all smiles despite the biting cold. "Look at you, Andy," Ethan said, giving him a friendly jab on the shoulder. "Finally decided to come out of that city life for once." Andy laughed. "Only for you guys. Besides, I needed a break from DC. But hey, you all know I'd only brave this snowstorm for my favorite people." As they chatted, memories of late-night study sessions, adventures, and laughs from their college days poured out. The group's dynamic was natural and easy, despite the time apart. Now let's come to the restaurant scene. They headed inside Benny's, shaking the snow from their coats. Benny's Grill was a cozy spot, packed with people seeking warmth and good food. As they settled into a booth and ordered drinks, the conversation turned to New Year's resolutions, work, and their favorite memories from college. "Ryan," Mary said, nudging him, "so are you planning to entertain us all week? I came all this way to finally see Hollows Peak. You better have some adventure planned." "Don't worry," Ryan replied. "I know all the best spots around here. We'll have a great time." But before their laughter could fill the booth, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. A hush fell as a group of police officers walked in, their expressions grim. They moved directly to the restaurant's manager, and a low murmur spread through the diners as people speculated about what was happening. Ethan leaned over to their server as she walked by, asking quietly, "Any idea what's going on?" The server lowered her voice. "There was another attack nearby. A woman was found in the woods behind the old mansion up the hill. They say it's gruesome. Some people think it's haunted, but, well, it's not the first case like this in Hollows Peak." At the mention of the mansion, Ryan's expression darkened. The mansion she referred to had a dark history. It had been the scene of horrifying crimes years ago, and locals claimed it was haunted. Most avoided it altogether, except for occasional daredevils and ghost hunters who thought it'd be fun to test their courage. Andy raised an eyebrow. "Wait, an old haunted mansion? Now this is sounding like a horror movie. I didn't know you had this kind of place up here, Ryan." Ryan shrugged, attempting a laugh, but his discomfort showed. "It's not exactly the best tourist spot. Locals call it the Reed Manor. Years back, a man, some kind of psycho, I think he was named Darren Reed, murdered his wife there and a few other people. Rumor has it he was a disturbed guy with a bad temper, and after he was caught, some people say he cursed the place, but that's just old ghost stories, I'm sure." Ethan chuckled, but Mary looked intrigued. Her curiosity sparked. So this Reed guy, they say he still haunts it. Some people do, Ryan replied hesitantly, especially since people keep reporting strange things there. A few folks have even disappeared around the area, though no one's proved anything. A few brave souls tried to investigate, but they're convinced the place is cursed. Hollows Peak is a small town, and rumors fly, you know? Mary's eyes lit up. That sounds incredible. I've always wanted to check out a real haunted place. Don't tell me you've never been, Ryan. Ryan laughed. Me? No way. I might know every back road and shortcut in Hollows Peak, but Reed Manor, that's one place I've stayed away from. But the challenge in Mary's eyes sparked a new energy around the table. It was exactly the kind of thrill she'd come here hoping to find, and Andy and Ethan were equally intrigued. Andy leaned in with a mischievous smile. What if we checked it out tonight? Come on, Ryan. It'll be like our college road trips, except, you know, haunted. Ethan grinned, looking both excited and a little nervous. I'm up for it. But you're sure this place isn't, like, actually dangerous? Ryan hesitated, glancing at each of them. He knew Reed Manor's dark history better than most, but he also didn't want to be the one who spoiled the reunion by backing out. A mix of excitement and dread filled him as he finally nodded. All right, he said reluctantly, but don't say I didn't warn you. Reed Manor's about as eerie as they come. And with that, the group left the restaurant, ready for a night they would never forget. The night was getting darker, and a fresh layer of snow blanketed the winding, narrow road leading up to the old mansion. The headlights of Andy's truck barely pierced through the dense snowfall, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees lining the road. Reed Manor was just up the hill from Hollows Peak, far enough from town that few people dared to visit. You guys really think this is a good idea? Ryan asked from the back seat, a note of hesitation in his voice as he glanced through the fogged-up window. The stories of Reed Manor had kept him up more than one night as a kid, and the idea of returning to it as an adult hadn't exactly been on his bucket list. Come on, man, Andy replied, gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the steep incline. Where's your sense of adventure? This is just what we need to shake off the work-life routine. Mary, sitting beside Ryan, leaned forward. Plus, it'll be just like old times, right? We used to do this kind of stuff all the time in college. Ethan, who had stayed uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. Yeah, well, I'm down to check it out, but I hope none of this haunted stuff is real. I don't mess with ghosts, man. They laughed, trying to keep the mood light. But as the truck climbed higher, the road narrowed, and the trees pressed in around them, casting long shadows that seemed to move and twist in the headlights. Snow-covered branches reached over the road like skeletal arms, and the silence of the night weighed down on them as they approached the mansion's driveway. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was only a few more minutes, Reed Manor loomed into view. The mansion was as chilling as Ryan remembered from when he'd seen it as a kid, though it was now even more decrepit. Standing 3 stories high with its roof partially caved in and windows shattered, Reed Manor seemed to glare down at them. Blackened marks from an old fire scarred the walls, and weeds had overtaken what was once a grand entrance. The place was silent, save for the crunch of snow under their boots as they stepped out of the truck, and the howling wind that carried an eerie, hollow sound through the trees. "Whoa," Mary whispered, staring up at the ominous structure. "This is way creepier than I imagined." Andy laughed, but his voice shook. "Looks like something out of a horror movie, right?" Ethan, already feeling a gnawing sense of regret, looked back at the truck. "You guys sure we want to do this? I mean, we can still turn around." But Mary shook her head. "Come on, Ethan. We're here. Might as well make the most of it." She grabbed his arm playfully and pulled him toward the mansion, and, reluctantly, the others followed. As they approached the front steps, Ryan noticed something odd. The mansion seemed to almost breathe. The shadows cast by the shattered windows flickered, and he could have sworn he saw movement inside. "Did anyone else see that?" Ryan asked, stopping short. "See what?" Andy asked, looking around. "I don't know. Probably just shadows," Ryan replied, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as Ryan pushed it open, and a blast of stale, icy air greeted them. The entryway was covered in dust and soot, and cobwebs laced every corner, stretching down from the high ceiling like gossamer threads. The grand staircase before them led to the upper floors, its banister broken in several places, and there were doorways leading off to shadowed rooms on either side of the hall. Mary took out her phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a faint beam that did little to dispel the darkness. "This place is straight up creepy. I can't believe anyone would want to live here. Or die here," Ethan muttered, looking around anxiously. "You guys know that people actually went missing in here, right? Like, never found." Found. The group fell silent as they walked further inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty rooms. The place had a feeling about it, like it was holding its breath, waiting. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the mansion, as if the very walls were watching them. They reached a large parlor, where the remnants of a fireplace sat charred and blackened. A few decrepit pieces of furniture lay scattered around, their fabric torn and mold-ridden. A single, large portrait hung on the wall, its frame tarnished and dusty. Ryan stepped closer to get a better look, wiping a layer of grime off the glass. It was a portrait of a man with dark eyes and a severe expression, his face twisted in what looked like anger or sorrow. "Who do you think that is?" Andy asked, peering over Ryan's shoulder. "I'd bet money it's Darren Reed," Ryan whispered, "the psycho who used to live here." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the room, as the door they had entered through swung shut on its own. Everyone jumped, spinning around to face the now-closed door. Did one of you do that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Ryan shook his head, his pulse racing. No one was near it. Andy forced a laugh. "It's just the wind or something, no big deal." But as he turned, he noticed Mary staring at something on the wall beside the fireplace. "Hey, you guys, check this out," she said, her voice low. They gathered around to see what she was looking at. A strange mark, dark and smudged, like a handprint. But this handprint wasn't made of dust or dirt. It looked like soot. It was smeared across the wall, the fingers stretched in unnatural angles, as though someone had pressed their hand there while it was still burning. Ethan backed away, his breathing growing quicker. "All right, I'm done. This is messed up. Let's go." But just as he turned to leave, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond the parlor, heavy, slow, and deliberate. The friends exchanged nervous glances, frozen in place. The footsteps drew closer, creaking across the floorboards. Then they stopped just outside the parlor door. "Hello!" Ryan called, his voice wavering. No response, only silence. "Ryan?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let's get out of here." Ryan nodded, but as they moved toward the parlor door, a cold draft swept through the room, and the door creaked open a few inches, as though inviting them deeper into the mansion. "Ryan, what's happening?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his voice. I don't know," Ryan replied, taking a step back. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house wanted them to stay, wanted them to come closer. Against his better judgment, Ryan took another step toward the door, and the others reluctantly followed. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the shadows as they stepped into the hallway beyond. The walls here were cracked and peeling, with a smell of mildew and rot hanging in the air. The temperature dropped even further, and every creak of the floorboards underfoot seemed deafening in the silence. Then, from the darkness ahead, a faint whisper echoed down the hall. "Why, have you come?" Ryan felt his blood run cold. The voice was soft, almost inaudible, but it sounded as if it were coming from all around them. He turned, ready to bolt, but Andy grabbed his arm. "Don't run," Andy whispered. "Whatever this is, we don't want to set it off." Ethan's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. He cursed, shaking it frantically, but it refused to turn back on. Just as Mary was about to hand him her phone for light, she let out a scream and pointed at something on the wall beside them. A fresh handprint, identical to the one in the parlor, was smeared just inches from her face, and it looked freshly made, still wet and black. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. Turning as one, they sprinted back down the hallway, back toward the front door, desperately hoping to escape. But as they reached the entryway, the door was closed and locked, the old wood and iron bolts sealing them in. Panic set in as they pounded on the door, but it refused to budge. The house felt alive, as if it were pulsing with a dark, twisted energy, and they could almost feel it mocking their attempts to escape. Finally, Ryan turned back to his friends, his face pale. "We're not alone in here." The reality of their situation settled over them like a suffocating fog. Whatever haunted Reed Manor was awake now, and it was not going to let them leave. Trapped inside Reed Manor, Ryan, Mary, Ethan and Andy stood in the dim hallway, their breaths visible in the icy air. Fear hung thick around them as they processed the terrifying truth. They were no longer alone. "Ryan, what do we do now?" Mary whispered, clutching his arm. Ryan scanned their surroundings, his mind racing for options. "We need to find another way out. Maybe there's an open window somewhere in the back." Andy nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly, and led the way, though his usual confidence had faded. They followed the narrow hallway, stepping carefully over the creaking floorboards as their footsteps echoed in the silence. The darkness seemed thicker here, like a fog that pressed in around them, swallowing the light of their flashlights. They passed through another doorway into a grand but decaying sitting room. Large, dusty windows lined one wall, casting only faint shadows in the night. The once elegant furniture was now broken and coated in grime, and torn, moth-eaten curtains drooped like ghosts in the corners. In the center of the room stood a grand piano, its cover open to reveal keys stained a sickly yellow. Ethan approached the windows, gripping the wooden frame. He rattled the glass, but it didn't budge. They're all nailed shut. "We'd need a crowbar or something to break these open." Andy turned to look back at the doorway they'd come through, suddenly freezing. "Guys, did anyone else hear that?" They all stopped, straining to listen. Faintly from somewhere upstairs came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of them. The creaking grew louder, moving across the ceiling directly above them, as if something was pacing the floors. Mary's face went pale. "Oh, God, is someone up there?" Ryan shook his head slowly. "There shouldn't be." The footsteps stopped, and a sudden silence fell over the house. For a moment, everything was deathly still. But then, with a loud crash, a heavy thud came from directly above, making the floor beneath their feet tremble. The noise sounded as if something massive had dropped onto the floor above them. Ethan backed away toward the door. "I'm not sticking around to find out what that was. Let's keep moving." The group turned to leave, but as they moved into the hallway, Mary gasped. Along the walls were more soot-covered handprints, smeared in streaks that seemed to follow them. "What is this place?" she whispered, trembling. Ryan forced himself to keep going, though every fiber of his being wanted to turn and run. Maybe it's just soot from the fire that burned this place. Let's stay calm." But Mary wasn't convinced. "No, Ryan, these are fresh. Something is making them right now." Ethan, trying to mask his fear, stepped past her. "Then let's get out of here before it decides to do something worse." They found a narrow hallway leading deeper into the house. Hoping it might lead to a back exit, they moved quickly, but the hallway seemed to stretch on and on, with no doorways or windows in sight. "Are we going in circles?" Andy asked, glancing back and seeing only darkness stretching behind them. Ryan shook his head. "No, we're moving in one direction, but this hallway doesn't seem to end." Just then, the whispering began again, echoing softly down the hallway. Faint and disjointed, like voices heard underwater. Each step seemed to amplify the sound, and soon they could make out words. "Go back. Leave. He'll find you." Mary clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut as if to block out the whispers. "Stop it. Stop it." Ryan reached for her shoulder. "It's okay, Mary. Just focus on me, all right? We're getting out of here." But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood turn cold. Up ahead, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure at the end of the hallway. A tall, shadowed man, standing perfectly still. The figure was blurred, almost like smoke, but there was no mistaking the hollow, burned eyes and twisted expression on his face. He wore a charred suit, his face scarred and distorted, as if he'd suffered the same fire that had left its mark on the house. Ryan's throat went dry as he realized who, or what, he was staring at. "Is that Darren Reed?" he managed to say. The others followed his gaze, and a collective gasp escaped them as they saw the figure. It watched them unmoving, its presence heavy and oppressive, filling the hallway with an icy chill that made their breath catch. Ethan took a shaky step back. "Ryan, tell me you're seeing this too." But before Ryan could respond, the figure dissolved into a dark mist, spreading like smoke down the hallway toward them. "Run!" Ryan shouted, grabbing Mary's hand and pulling her down the hallway. They turned blindly through the maze of rooms and halls, the echoing whispers growing louder, filling the house with a maddening cacophony. Doors slammed shut on either side of them, trapping them as they stumbled through, desperately searching for any way out. Finally, they found themselves at the entrance to a staircase leading down. The walls around it were charred and cracked, and the air reeked of mildew and something fouler, like decayed flesh. Andy stopped, doubling over as he caught his breath. "Isn't going down a terrible idea?" Ethan looked back toward the hallway, where the dark mist seemed to be seeping closer, crawling along the floor like some living shadow. "Whatever that is, it's coming. I'd take my chances with the basement over that thing any day." Ryan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "It's our only option." One by one, they descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously beneath them. The basement was even colder than the floors above, and their flashlights barely cut through the thick darkness. As they reached the bottom, their footsteps echoed in the vast open space. The basement was unlike anything they had expected. It was huge, with stone walls and a low ceiling, filled with old, broken furniture, rotting crates, and piles of junk. The walls were lined with shelves that held strange objects, old glass jars filled with murky liquid, rusted tools, and the remnants of dusty candles. Ryan shone his flashlight over the floor and froze. Scattered around them were bones, human bones, half buried in the dirt floor, as though someone had tried to hide them hastily. Mary choked back a scream. "Oh my God! Are those—" Ethan swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's been more than one victim here." They backed away from the pile of bones, but just as they turned, a loud click echoed through the basement. The door at the top of the stairs had shut itself, trapping them. Ryan ran to the stairs, pounding on the door. "No, no, no, no! Someone help us!" But there was no response, only silence, thick and heavy, as the darkness closed in around them. "Ryan, look," Andy said, pointing to the far corner of the basement. They all turned to see another figure slowly emerging from the shadows. It was the same man, the ghostly image of Darren Reed, now even more solid and lifelike, his burned, twisted face leering at them. In his hand was a long, rusted knife, its edge jagged and stained. "I told you to leave," the figure whispered, his voice a low growl. "Now you'll never leave." The friends stumbled back, but as they moved, Reed's figure lunged forward with a guttural snarl, his knife slashing through the air. Andy grabbed an old broken chair and swung it, trying to fend off the ghostly figure, but it passed right through him, leaving a searing, icy burn across his arm. Ryan and the others huddled together, their backs against the stone wall. Every escape route was blocked, and the ghost advanced on them, his expression one of twisted satisfaction. Ryan's mind raced, desperately trying to think of something, anything, that could stop the spirit. Just then, his flashlight caught the glint of something metallic in the shadows. A small, old-fashioned revolver, half buried in a pile of rubble. Without thinking, he grabbed it, feeling the cold, heavy weight of it in his hand. He aimed it at the advancing figure, squeezing the trigger. The gun clicked, empty, but the sound was enough to make the spirit hesitate, its face contorting with fury. "You think you can stop me?" Reed snarled, his voice echoing through the basement. "This is my house, my domain, and I will claim you all." Ryan held the gun steady, hoping to buy them time. "Not if we can stop you first," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. The spirit's eyes glinted with malice as it took another step forward, raising the knife. And then, from the darkness behind them, a soft voice whispered, "There is a way to end him." The friends whipped around but saw no one, only shadows shifting across the basement walls. But the voice continued, low and desperate. "Find the knife. In his study. It holds his soul. Only that can end him." Ryan's grip on the gun tightened as he glanced at his friends. Did you all hear that?" Mary nodded, wide-eyed. "The study. We need to find it." Before they could second-guess themselves, they turned and sprinted for the stairs, climbing as fast as they could, hoping that finding the knife would give them the edge they needed against the malevolent spirit. Ryan, Mary, Ethan, and Andy scrambled up the narrow staircase from the basement, barely daring to look behind them. The whispered message still echoed in Ryan's mind. "Find the knife. In his study. It holds his soul." The sound of Darren Reed's ominous voice seemed to cling to the walls, like a dark presence watching their every move. Bursting out of the basement, they found themselves in a dimly lit hallway once more. The entire house felt colder, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for them to make a fatal mistake. "We need to find that study," Ryan said, glancing around as he tried to get his bearings. "It's our only chance." Mary looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "Do you even know where it might be?" Ryan hesitated. "I remember the layout a little. I think it's upstairs, at the end of the main hall, but we need to hurry, before he catches up." They moved quickly, every creak of the floorboards sending chills down their spines. The mansion seemed to shift around them, with shadows deepening and shifting, as if the house itself was trying to keep them lost within its walls. They climbed the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The upper floor was even darker than the rest of the house, with only the occasional flicker of their flashlights illuminating the hallway ahead. Dust covered every surface, and broken furniture lined the corridor, untouched and decaying for years. Ethan, bringing up the rear, stopped suddenly, glancing back over his shoulder. He was certain he'd heard something, a whisper, a faint sound of movement. The hallway behind him looked empty, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. "Hurry!" he whispered, urging the others forward. Finally, they reached the last door at the end of the hallway. It was a heavy, dark wood door, slightly ajar, with scorched marks along the edges. As they pushed it open, the room inside was revealed. A large study, its walls lined with shelves stacked with dusty books. The room smelled of mildew and burnt wood, and the dim light barely revealed a massive desk in the center of the room, with a few broken chairs scattered around. Mary moved toward the desk, scanning the top for any sign of the knife. "Do you think he actually kept it in here?" "Who knows?" Andy muttered, his flashlight flicking around the room. "But we have to keep looking." They searched the shelves, pulling aside old, tattered books and broken knickknacks, but found nothing. Just as despair was starting to creep in, Ethan spotted a small cabinet in the corner, partially hidden by a rotting tapestry. "Over here," he called out, yanking the cabinet open. Inside, resting atop a dusty pile of papers, lay an old hunting knife. The blade was tarnished and rusted, but it gleamed with an unnatural dark energy, almost as if it were pulsing. "That's it," Mary whispered, reaching out for it. But before she could touch it, a cold wind swept through the room, blowing the door shut with a loud slam. The temperature plummeted, and the faint smell of smoke filled the air. They froze as the familiar, chilling voice spoke, echoing around them. "You thought you could take what is mine." They turned, and there he was, Darren Reed. His ghostly form was clearer than before, his scarred, hollow face twisted in rage. His eyes, black and burning with malice, fixed on them as he moved closer, his form flickering between solid and shadowy. Ryan stepped in front of Mary, shielding her as he grabbed the knife from the cabinet. "Stay back!" he yelled, though he knew how powerless they were against this malevolent spirit. Darren Reed let out a low, mocking laugh. "You think that will help you? You don't belong here. This is my domain, and you will suffer as they all have suffered." The walls seemed to close in, and the room filled with a suffocating darkness. Ryan gripped the knife tightly, feeling a strange warmth emanate from the handle. It was as if the knife itself was charged with energy, a weapon perhaps, but also a curse. Without another thought, Ryan lunged forward, slashing the knife through the air. To his shock, the blade connected with Reed's form, slicing through it with a hissing sound. The ghost recoiled, a look of fury contorting his face. "You will pay!" Reed screamed, his voice echoing with a bone-chilling wail. Andy, realizing the knife's power, grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it through Reed's form, but it passed through harmlessly. Only the knife seemed to affect him. The ghost turned his gaze to Andy, his eyes burning with rage as he extended a hand. Suddenly, Andy was thrown backward, crashing into the bookshelf with a scream. "Ryan!" Mary cried. "Keep going! Don't let him get near us!" Ryan steadied himself, gripping the knife tighter. He stepped forward and slashed at the ghost again, his every strike filling the air with a crackling sound as the knife connected with Reed's ghostly form. The spirit let out a terrible howl, his image flickering like a flame about to go out. But Reed's form began to grow, expanding into a towering figure of shadow, his rage manifesting in a wave of energy that made the walls tremble. Books and debris flew across the room, and the entire mansion seemed to shake with his fury. Ryan stumbled back, but as he looked at the knife, a realization hit him. He had to strike at the source of Reed's power, his very heart. "Hold him back!" Ryan shouted to Ethan and Mary, who watched in terror as he moved closer. With a final burst of courage, Ryan lunged forward, driving the knife into the heart of the shadowy figure. The spirit let out a deafening shriek, his form twisting and writhing as the knife pierced his essence. The room filled with a blinding light, and then, all at once, the noise stopped. Reed's ghost was gone. The shadows receded, and an eerie silence fell over the mansion. The four friends stood in stunned silence, each breathing heavily as they processed what had just happened. Mary was the first to speak, her voice a hoarse whisper. Did we kill him?" Ryan looked down at the knife, now dull and lifeless in his hand. I think so. But we need to get out of here. Now." Without another word, they turned and made their way back down the hallway, down the grand staircase and to the front door, which now swung open easily. They didn't look back as they raced across the snow-covered grounds, the cold air stinging their faces as they finally escaped the grip of Reed Manor. They reached Andy's truck, climbed in, and sat there in silence, each of them processing the horrors they had just survived. It felt unreal, like a nightmare they were finally waking from. Andy broke the silence, gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the mansion in the rearview mirror. Let's never speak of this place again." Ethan, his voice shaky, muttered, "Agreed. I don't ever want to come near this place as long as I live." Ryan, still holding the knife, opened the door slightly and tossed it into the snow, watching it sink into the white powder before slamming the door shut. As they drove away, Reed Manor loomed in the distance, silent and dark once more, but they could all still feel its presence, as if it were watching them leave, waiting for the next group of foolish souls who would dare to enter. They drove in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, knowing that even though they'd escaped, the horrors of Reed Manor would stay with them forever. The drive back to Hollow's Peak was silent. Each friend was wrapped in their own thoughts, too drained and shaken to speak. The horrors they'd witnessed in Reed Manor, the spectre of Darren Reed, the cursed knife, the suffocating darkness, all seemed like a feverish nightmare. But the bruises and burns on their bodies were real, and the memory of Reed's malevolent spirit still lingered in their minds. As they reached Ryan's small cabin on the outskirts of town, he parked the truck and sat in silence, staring out at the snowy night. The wind howled outside, brushing snow against the truck's windows, and they all sat frozen, unwilling to leave the small, safe confines of the truck. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Did that really happen?" Mary nodded, her face pale and drawn. "It did. We barely made it out of there alive." Ryan exhaled, his hands still gripping the wheel. "Look, we survived, but I don't want to talk about this. Ever. That place, what we saw, I don't want it coming back into my life." They nodded in agreement, their faces tight with fear and exhaustion. After everything they'd been through, each of them knew that Reed Manor was something they would rather forget. As they went their separate ways that night, none of them could shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. A few days later, Ryan sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the snowfall blanketing Hollow's Peak. The house was quiet, but he felt an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. Shadows seemed longer, and the silence felt too heavy. He'd barely slept since their night at Reed Manor. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the darkened rooms, the twisting hallways, and Darren Reed's twisted face sneering at him, as if mocking him. He could still hear that cold, mocking whisper in the back of his mind. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from Mary. "Mary, hey, you been feeling strange since that night?" Ryan hesitated before responding, his fingers hovering over the screen. Ryan, "Yeah, like he's still watching or something. You?" Mary, "Yes, and last night, I saw something, like a shadow at the foot of my bed. When I turned on the light, it was gone, but I swear it looked like him." Ryan's chest tightened. He'd had a similar experience himself, waking up in the middle of the night to find the room icy cold, feeling as if someone or something was standing just out of sight in the shadows. Ryan, "Maybe it's just our minds playing tricks. We went through a lot." Mary, "Maybe, but it feels real, Ryan." Ryan put down the phone, a creeping dread settling over him. He glanced around his small cabin, shadows flickering as the sun began to set. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he caught a faint movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, expecting to see nothing. But there, just past the kitchen doorway, was a shadow, tall, unmoving, and watching him. "Hello," Ryan whispered, his voice barely a breath. But as he blinked, the shadow was gone. That evening he called Andy and Ethan, hoping to find reassurance, hoping they were also just experiencing the aftershocks of fear. But both of them admitted reluctantly that they too felt Reed's presence haunting their thoughts, lingering like a dark shadow. "I thought maybe it was just nightmares," Ethan admitted, his voice trembling. "But sometimes I wake up and it feels like someone's in the room with me, watching." Andy's voice was equally shaken. "I've been seeing things, soot-covered handprints on my walls, on the mirrors, and last night I heard footsteps." They all went silent, the weight of their shared horror sinking in. "Do you think maybe we didn't finish it?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper, as if she feared speaking the words aloud would make it true. Ryan's mind raced, replaying the events of that night. The knife, the spirit's screams. Had they done enough, or had they only angered Reed's spirit, binding him to them? "I don't know," Ryan replied, swallowing hard. "But whatever it is, we have to move on. Let's just keep an eye on things, try to let it go." Over the following weeks, each of them tried to return to their normal lives, hoping the horrors of Reed Manor would fade. But as the months passed, strange incidents followed them. Ryan would come home to find his front door wide open, though he was certain he'd locked it. Shadows flitted in the corners of his vision, always disappearing when he turned to look. And every now and then, he would hear that mocking whisper echoing in the quiet of his home. Mary began having nightmares of being trapped in the basement of Reed Manor, unable to escape as Darren Reed's figure loomed over her. She'd wake up sweating, her skin cold, only to find dark handprints smeared on her bedroom wall. Ethan tried to brush off the strange occurrences in his home, the cold spots, the flickering lights. But late at night, he swore he could hear Reed's footsteps approaching his bedroom, and Andy, always the skeptic, tried to push the memories aside. But one evening, as he stepped into his bathroom, he saw something that made him freeze. In the steam on his bathroom mirror were scrawled words in large, jagged letters. "You will never leave." One by one, they realized that Darren Reed's curse was far from over. The ghostly presence that haunted Reed Manor had latched onto them, following them into their lives, feeding on their fear. And as the days turned into weeks, they could no longer deny that the horrors of that cursed mansion were still with them. The weeks turned into months, and the eerie presence of Darren Reed's spirit continued to haunt Ryan, Mary, Ethan, and Andy, pulling them deeper into fear. Strange occurrences followed them everywhere, shadows lurking, whispers in the dark, and the chilling sensation of being watched. Ryan had tried every logical explanation he could think of, but the truth was unavoidable. Reed's spirit had attached itself to them, feeding off their fear, as if the curse of Reed Manor had bound them to the house and its horrors forever. Desperate to end the haunting, Ryan reached out to a paranormal investigator, someone he hoped might know how to sever the connection. Her name was Dr. Elaine Russell, a retired professor of folklore who had spent her career investigating cursed objects and haunted places. After a lengthy conversation over the phone, Dr. Russell agreed to meet with the group. The following Saturday, Ryan, Mary, Ethan, and Andy gathered at Ryan's cabin. Dr. Russell arrived just before dusk, a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a presence that filled the room. She carried a heavy leather-bound book and a few small bags of herbs and candles, setting them down on Ryan's coffee table. As she settled in, she glanced around at their anxious faces. "You all have been cursed," she said bluntly. When you entered that house, you awakened a spirit that was bound to it. Darren Reed is a tortured soul, angry and malevolent, and he has attached himself to you because you dared to confront him. Is there any way to stop this? Mary asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Russell nodded slowly. There may be a way, but I won't lie to you, it's dangerous. Breaking a curse like this will require confronting the spirit again, facing him in the place he died. You need to go back to Reed Manor. A chill settled over the room as her words sank in. The idea of returning to the mansion was terrifying, but they were all running out of options. Andy shook his head. Are you serious? We barely got out alive last time. Dr. Russell nodded, understanding their fear. If you do nothing, this curse will only get stronger. Darren Reed is drawing power from you, binding you to him. It's why you see shadows, hear whispers, why you feel his presence wherever you go. If you're willing, I can help prepare you. But the decision to go back must be yours. They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Ryan took a deep breath. We don't have a choice. We can't live like this, haunted, always looking over our shoulders. We have to finish this. The others nodded, reluctant but resolute. They'd already suffered enough, and if there was even a small chance of breaking the curse, they had to try. Dr. Russell spent the next hour explaining what they would need to do. She'd brought candles, chalk and salt to create a protective circle, as well as sage and a small vial of holy water. She laid out a plan for them to follow precisely, warning them that any break in the ritual could leave them trapped in the house with Reed's spirit forever. When you enter the house, you'll need to light these candles and place them in a circle in the parlor, Dr. Russell instructed, her voice steady but intense. This will be your protection. Once inside, call out to him. Let him know you're not afraid. You must confront him directly. Reed's spirit thrives on fear, and if you let him intimidate you, he'll overpower you. Andy, still hesitant, asked, And what happens if he does? Dr. Russell met his gaze, her expression grave. Then he'll bind you to the house permanently. He'll feed off your fear until there's nothing left of you but a shadow, like him. The gravity of her words hung in the air, but each of them knew there was no turning back. With the ritual explained and supplies gathered, they prepared for their return to Reed Manor. The night was dark and still as they approached the mansion once more. Snow covered the ground, blanketing the landscape in eerie silence. Reed Manor loomed above them, as dark and menacing as they remembered. Every broken window, every shadowed corner seemed to be waiting for them, drawing them back into its haunted depths. They gathered just outside the front door, taking a deep breath as Dr. Russell handed each of them a candle and a small pouch of salt. Ryan felt the weight of the moment settling over him. They were about to confront the ghost that had haunted their every thought for months. "Stay together," Ryan whispered as he opened the door. The entryway was just as they remembered it, but the air was even colder, as if the mansion itself knew they had returned. They moved quickly, lighting the candles and setting them in a circle in the middle of the parlor, the flames casting strange shadows that flickered across the walls. Ryan took a deep breath, his voice steady but tense. "Darren Reed, we're here. You wanted us. You've haunted us, followed us. But this ends tonight." For a moment, nothing happened. The house was silent, the only sound their own breathing echoing off the walls. Then, a low, rumbling laugh echoed from the darkness, filling the room with a bone-chilling sound. "So, you've returned," a voice sneered, mocking. "Foolish. You should have stayed away." Darren Reed's form began to materialize in the center of the room, his shadowy figure looming over them. His eyes were black as coal, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. Mary gripped Ryan's arm, her hand trembling. "Stay calm," he whispered to her, though his own heart was pounding. Dr. Russell stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. "Darren Reed, spirit bound to this house, I command you to release these souls. They are not yours to torment." Reed's laughter grew louder, filling the room as his figure solidified, his form flickering between shadow and substance. He moved toward them, a blackened hand outstretched, reaching for Ryan. "You think you can defeat me? This is my domain. My power is absolute here." Ryan gripped the small pouch of salt and held it out, scattering it in a line between him and the advancing spirit. "We're not afraid of you anymore. We're here to end this." The salt sizzled as it hit the ground, creating a barrier that forced Reed to recoil, his face twisting in rage. "You dare defy me?" he hissed, his voice a mix of fury and disbelief. "I'll destroy you." But Dr. Russell held her ground, beginning to chant in a low, steady voice, her words in an ancient language none of them recognized. The air grew heavy, and the walls seemed to close in, as if the house itself were reacting to the ritual. The candles flickered, and Reed's figure began to waver, his outline blurring as if he were losing his grip on the physical world. His expression changed from anger to fear, his form shrinking as he struggled against the ritual's power. Ryan, emboldened, stepped forward. "You're nothing but a shadow, Reed. You can't haunt us anymore." Reed let out a final, desperate scream, his form dissolving into a dark mist that spiraled around them, trapped by the circle of candles. The mist swirled and twisted, fighting against the ritual's force until, finally, it collapsed inward, vanishing into nothingness. The house fell silent. The oppressive energy lifted, leaving the air clear and still for the first time since they'd entered. Slowly the group lowered their candles, the reality of what they'd just done sinking in. The heavy silence of Reed Manor was now just an emptiness, a void where the vengeful spirit had once lurked. "Is it over?" Mary whispered, glancing around, half expecting Reed to reappear. Dr. Russell nodded, her face softening with relief. "It's over. Darren Reed's spirit is gone." They made their way out of the mansion, stepping into the crisp night air. The weight of Reed's curse finally lifted. As they drove away, a quiet sense of peace filled them, a feeling they hadn't felt in months. Back at Ryan's cabin, they said their goodbyes to Dr. Russell, each of them grateful beyond words for her help. They still bore scars from Reed's haunting, but now they could finally begin to heal. And as the sun rose over Hollow's Peak, Ryan and his friends knew that, at last, they were free. It had been a month since Ryan, Mary, Ethan, and Andy returned to Reed Manor to break Darren Reed's curse. Dr. Russell assured them they were finally free, and the signs of the haunting had indeed faded. For the first time in months, each of them felt a sense of peace they hadn't thought possible. But in the quiet moments when they were alone with their thoughts, they couldn't shake a feeling that something was still off. Shadows lingered a bit too long, reflections in mirrors seemed faintly distorted, and occasionally they would wake in the middle of the night with an inexplicable chill running down their spines. Ryan tried to dismiss these sensations as remnants of trauma, a mind playing tricks. But soon he began to notice strange, subtle signs that left him unsettled. One chilly evening, Ryan returned to his cabin after a long day at work. He tossed his keys on the counter, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the couch, relieved to be home. As he closed his eyes, his mind drifted back to the night at Reed Manor. He'd tried so hard to forget it, to move on, but the memories still haunted him. A faint scraping sound snapped him out of his thoughts. He froze, straining to listen. It was coming from the kitchen, a steady, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Probably just the pipes, he muttered to himself, forcing a shaky laugh. But the tapping continued, louder this time, echoing in the quiet of the cabin. Ryan stood up slowly, his heart pounding as he moved toward the kitchen. The room was empty, but the tapping continued, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Swallowing hard, he bent down, pressing his ear to the floor. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Ryan." He scrambled back, his heart racing. It was impossible. Darren Reed was gone, his spirit exorcised, but the voice had been unmistakable, as if the walls themselves were calling to him. The next day, he called Mary. When Mary, Ethan and Andy arrived at Ryan's cabin, they shared a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Each of them had tried to bury the memories of Reed Manor, but now, gathered together again, the memories felt fresh, the fear creeping back in. Ryan recounted the strange sounds, the whisper he'd heard. When he finished, he looked around, hoping someone would laugh and tell him it was his imagination. But instead, Mary nodded, her face pale. "I've been hearing things too, Ryan, like whispers in the dark, just barely there. And sometimes I catch movement out of the corner of my eye." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I thought it was just nightmares, but I've seen shadows, like someone standing by my bed. I've tried to ignore it, but it feels like he's still here." Andy was silent for a long moment, looking down. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't want to say anything, but last night I found something on my mirror, written in the steam, in handwriting I didn't recognize. It said, 'You didn't finish.'" The words hung heavy in the air. They had faced Reed, performed the ritual as doctor. Russell instructed. How could any of this still be happening? Desperate for answers, they contacted Dr. Russell again, and she agreed to meet them at her small office in town. When they arrived, her expression was grave as she listened to their stories, her brow furrowed. "This is unusual," she admitted, tapping her fingers on the table thoughtfully. "You performed the ritual exactly as I instructed. Reed's spirit should have been exorcised. Then why does it feel like he's still here?" Mary asked, her voice wavering. Dr. Russell took a deep breath. "There may be another explanation, something I didn't consider. Some spirits don't attach themselves to a place. They attach themselves to people. If Reed's hatred and vengeance were strong enough, he may have bound himself not just to Reed Manor, but to each of you. The ritual we performed only targeted the house. It didn't address any bond he might have formed with you." A cold silence fell over them as they processed her words. "So, he's not gone?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Russell shook her head slowly. "It's possible he isn't. If his spirit is still attached to you, it's likely weaker than before, but Reed's anger and obsession could have given him enough strength to linger." "Is there anything we can do?" Ryan asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Dr. Russell thought for a moment, then nodded. "There is a more powerful ritual, but it would be dangerous. This ritual would have to break the bond he's formed with each of you. It requires confronting the spirit in its rawest form, inviting it to manifest fully." "Fully?" Andy repeated, his face pale. "Yes," she said solemnly. "You would have to allow Reed to manifest within this space, draw him out, and then sever the bond directly. This ritual demands a strong will. Any weakness could give the spirit control, but if it succeeds, he would be exorcised permanently." They exchanged uneasy glances. The thought of facing Reed's spirit again was terrifying, but the alternative was living with his dark presence forever. Finally, they nodded. They would face him one last time. Dr. Russell led them to a small ritual chamber at the back of her office, where candles were set in a circle on the floor. She directed each of them to sit within the circle, warning them to stay within its boundaries no matter what. When everything was prepared, she began to chant, her voice low and steady, the ancient words resonating through the room. The air grew cold, and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows along the walls. As her chanting grew louder, A dark mist began to form in the center of the circle, swirling and coalescing into a shape. The figure of Darren Reed began to emerge, his eyes blazing with fury as he took form, his face twisted into a snarl. "You dare summon me?" he hissed, his voice dripping with malice. Ryan met his gaze, forcing himself to stay calm. "This ends now, Reed. You don't own us." Reed laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You think you can free yourselves? I am bound to you. I am part of you. You'll never escape me." Dr. Russell continued chanting, her voice growing louder as the candles flared, their flames dancing as if caught in a storm. Reed's form began to waver, his expression turning from anger to fear as the ritual intensified. "Break the bond," Dr. Russell commanded, her voice ringing out. Ryan and the others focused, pouring every ounce of willpower they had into resisting Reed's presence. The room filled with an intense, blinding light as the spirit's form began to crack, dark mist spilling from the fractures. Reed let out a final, agonizing scream, his face contorted in rage and despair as he dissolved into shadow, vanishing into the light. Then, silence. When the light faded, the room returned to normal. The candles flickered, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone. Reed's presence had vanished, leaving only a quiet stillness in his wake. Dr. Russell exhaled, lowering her hands. "It's done. He's gone. For good this time." Relief washed over them as they left Dr. Russell's office, stepping into the cold night air. For the first time since they'd left Reed Manor, they felt a true sense of peace. The shadows felt lighter, the silence comforting rather than foreboding. Over the following weeks, they each began to heal, their lives slowly returning to normal. The nightmares faded, the whispers silenced, and the dark shadows no longer lurked in their homes. They would never forget Reed Manor or the horrors they had faced, but the darkness had lifted, allowing them to move forward. At last, the haunting was truly over, or so they hoped. So friends, today's story ends here, and this was a story based on real events, and I hope you will feel a lot of fear. Well, how much interesting did you find the story? Tell me in the comment, and yes, very soon I am going to bring a new story for you, based on another real incident. Till then, goodbye, and keep subscribing to the channel.